Story 1. I've lived my entire life in Southwest Florida, or SWFL as we call it. This place is an odd mix of wild and urban, opulent and shabby, with sprawling mansions standing next to dilapidated crack dens. You can drive from a luxurious beachfront to a deep swamp in no time at all. Some areas, especially the subdivisions in Naples, have incredible wealth that's hard to comprehend until you see it. Despite all that money floating around, unless you're a really good bartender, it doesn't quite trickle down, especially in the quiet month of September. Florida basically has two seasons, hurricane and tourist. So, a few months ago, when the market went downhill, I decided it was high time to find a second job. One evening, I spotted an A-frame blackboard sign that read, Isaiah Combs 8 to 10 live, in front of a nearly empty bar on a busy street. I lugged in my PA system, my eyes scanning the room. The bar had a marble bar top and bleach-white walls, but it also had tacky metal signs with messages like, if you ain't fallen over yet, you need another beer, and if beer isn't the answer, you're asking the wrong question. These signs seemed out of place, like they belonged in your uncle's man cave filled with items from Temu and Hobby Lobby. About 4 or 5 years ago, someone had a vision of this place being as classy as a 5-star hotel lobby bar. That all changed when a new owner or manager decided this is not what a bar looks like. A bar needs a pool table and dartboard. When my eyes met the bartender's, I could tell he didn't want to be there any more than I did. He looked to be in his late 20s, wearing a black button-down shirt and a black tie. I wasn't sure if my polo shirt was out of place in this setting. "Can I help you with something, man?" he asked, his accent vaguely European. "Yeah, I'm Isaiah. I'm playing here tonight. Liza didn't tell me where she wanted me to set up over the phone." The bartender pointed to an empty floor space in front of the touch tune next to a vintage wine cabinet. I bent my knees and carried my speakers over there. I could see a faded line on the linoleum floor, bordered by black gunk where an old runner rug used to be duct taped down. No one had thought to clean it up before years of patrons made it a permanent fixture in this mismatched bar. I was starting to dislike the place. Whether it was the bar or the whole city, I couldn't decide. I set up my equipment quickly, since there were no drunks eyeing me, waiting to yell "free bird" in about 10 to 15 minutes. The bar was empty except for me and the bartender, who told me his name, but I couldn't make sense of it. I jammed by myself for an hour. An old man shuffled in, looking for the bathroom, but my tip jar remained as dry as a flood-controlled swamp. My calloused fingers flaked off skin with each chord change. The clock dragged closer to 10 p.m. By then, a regular had seated himself far from me at the bar. I set up my harmonica to play Seminole Wind. When I was a kid, my dad used to take me on trips to the Everglades. He told me stories about the skunk ape, basically South Florida's version of Bigfoot. I loved those stories. We'd pack bologna and cheese sandwiches, bug spray, flashlights, binoculars and fishing gear, and spend the day in the swamp looking for the elusive creature. Our 2001 Saturn view would hit Alligator Alley like Magellan sailing the high seas. We never found anything, but I still hope there are strange creatures out there. I've always been fascinated by the unknown, though I'm rational enough to know there's likely no Bigfoot or other cryptids. If there are, they're just part of nature we haven't discovered yet. My phone rang. It was Harvey, the guy who got me this gig. At least I would make $250. Harvey had recently been promoted from acquaintance to good friend. Everyone has quirks and flaws, but sometimes Harvey was a lot to handle. "You big dog," Harvey shouted through my phone. "How's the hideout?" "Making stacks." "Not really. There's one guy here, and he hasn't taken his eyes off his beer since he sat down 10 minutes ago." I leaned against the wall between the out-of-order men's and women's restrooms as my iPad played my music. "Man, that sucks, dude. If I'm being honest, I do not like Liza. She gives off bad vibes." "Yeah, I don't know, dude," I said, thinking about the old guy who might have used the women's restroom. "Oh, before I forget, you're still looking for something steady, right? Harvey was about to save me again. Dude, I'm always looking. What do you have? Okay, so my uncle's friend needs extra help at some wildlife sanctuary or nature trail. What kind of work? Bro, it's easy. A big animal research center in the middle of nowhere just needs a guy. A guy to do what? Just menial stuff. Watch the place, pick up heavy things, basically security. This place is in the woods somewhere. Yeah, deep in Fakahatchee or Picayune. No one for miles, easy money. The regular at the bar started coughing, but the bartender didn't look up from his phone. I noticed he was wearing AirPods. Harvey, text me your uncle's friend's number. Sure thing. Let me know if Liza gives you trouble. She stiffed me last week. On Monday afternoon, I drove out to the Gore Research Center. This place was really out in the middle of nowhere. Florida is funny like that. It's like the rest of the country, but smaller and more intense. Most people live on the coast where all the money is. But if you drive just 25 minutes inland, it feels like you're in a different state, like Louisiana. I live about 10 minutes from one of the Bidens, and another 20 minutes from there, my dad once found an overturned boat with a bale of marijuana inside. I didn't even know marijuana came in bales. A word of advice, never try to stab one of those thinking you can just take a little bit. They are super compact. They had prison crews cleaning up the mess for a couple of days. I had been driving for about 30 minutes to meet the woman in charge of the facility. My sedan was not the best vehicle for this trip. It hadn't rained in about 4 days, which was unusual for that time of year, but it worked in my favor. I turned right off Golden Gate Parkway and headed deep into the Picayune Strand State Forest. Traffic slowly disappeared as the roads got worse. The homes along the county road became fewer and more run down. American flags turned into Trump flags turned into rebel flags, and rebel flags turned into trees. After a few miles, I saw a road sign that read, "End County Maintenance." Thud. The car lurched from the asphalt onto the rough limestone sand and dirt, kicking up a cloud behind me as I bumped along the landscape. Most of the journey was now on unpaved roads. I had never been out this way before. It was like a maze of left and right turns. RVs were parked in clearings, doing who knows what, and there were strange wooden structures suspended between the trees. I passed a dead deer around 133rd Avenue. I pulled up to the gate about 2 hours before sunset. My battle-weary Hyundai was splattered with mud, dirt, and grime as it idled, waiting for the gate to open. I checked my messages with the contact I was given. They hadn't been delivered. I had 1 bar of LTE this far out, which honestly surprised me. I sent a new message informing her I was outside. While waiting, I took stock of my surroundings. There were 3 signs on a post that read, "No trespassers, keep out," Nathloriendum Wildlife Sanctuary, and the third, "Be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time?" Ecclesiastes 7:17. It was only a few moments before the front gate roared to life. The house looked like something out of Swiss Family Robinson. Towering on all sides were live oaks, cypress, and ficus trees. The unkempt driveway led to a winding staircase covered by a strangler fig. Jasmine vines climbed the banister on the front porch up to the 2nd floor, with wilted white flowers scattered on the ground. Spanish moss covered the trees and shrouded the home, drawing the eye to an observation deck on what looked to be the 3rd floor. It was as if nature was reclaiming what was once hers. She must have been in her early 60s, with grey roots just starting to show in her tightly packed jet black hair. "Isaiah, so good to see you," she called out from the front door. Her voice was much louder than you'd expect for the distance between us. I had to match her energy. "Deb, nice to finally meet in person." Feeling the need to take control of this new setting, I quickly closed the distance between us, scaling the derelict staircase with my hand outstretched. My enthusiasm felt a bit over the top. The gentle breeze against my palm made it clear that clammy beads of sweat had formed. "Come in, son." I'll let you get your bearings. Deb showed me inside an immaculately clean house. House is the wrong word. It was more like a museum. There were no TVs or kitchen appliances, just a coffee maker on the welcome desk. Above the desk was a portrait of a smiling, white-haired, bearded old man with a golden retriever sitting on the front step of the old staircase before the strangler fig took over. Deb tossed her jean jacket onto a coat rack by the front door and turned towards me, clasping her hands together and rocking from heel to toe. Well, welcome to the Education Centre. This is, of course, Dr. Bob's former home. We do tours, craft days, and the occasional field trip. Well, not so occasional. It's a bit far and obscure, and schools don't like the negative connotation. Anyway, that doesn't stop the great work we do. Deb's eyes lit up as she spoke. So this is a conservation collier restoration site. Basically, we are working to return this area to its natural habitat. This is a hardwood cypress swamp forest. While being in the Picayune Strand, we are also in the middle of Big Cypress's critical area of state concern. Deb led me to the rear of the house, passing photographs and newspapers on the wall, captioned like a museum exhibit. We work to create awareness and, of course, have people on the ground here during the day. We monitor the growth of trees, the population of panthers, the quality of water, and many other things. The farther people are from these vital environments, the more they tend to do well and flourish. We crossed a corridor that was blocked by a red velvet rope and two green, once golden stands. I looked inside and saw one of those wheeled ladders you see in old libraries. I turned back to her and said, "Keep Florida wild." Exactly. Yes, that's so good. I like that, she responded enthusiastically. I felt bad because I was just repeating an Instagram caption I had seen. We stood there for a moment in silence. I just smiled and nodded. "Oh," she exclaimed suddenly, clapping her hands together. "I'll drop off the W-9 and other documents when I meet you in the morning. Let me show you around now." She turned towards the front door. This was Robert's entertaining area. He used it alone with hardly any visitors. People who knew him described him as a bit of a grouch. She led me to the front reception, where I saw the word Nath Lorendum posted above the door. I took out my phone to Google it. Just as we were rounding the desk to climb a second-story staircase, Deb interrupted. "Most of what you need you can find in or under here, including a charger." She handed me a lightning cable. "Thanks. Absolutely. Now follow me up here and I'll show you some exhibits." Deb grabbed the guardrail to the staircase and knocked on it 3 times. As we ascended, the age of the building began to show. The air grew still, and I smelled a faint, nostalgic aroma of mildew. The musty air swirled as Deb reached for an old yellowed light switch at the top of the stairs. Click. Nothing happened. "This darn thing," she muttered, flicking it on and off 3 times. The overhead lights buzzed, flickered, and finally turned on slowly like an old car. There was a taxidermied bear, a few wild boars, a buck and a doe, a bald eagle, gopher tortoises, and a few otters, all frozen in time. On the wall to the left was a nearly 6-foot-long tarpon. Deb pointed to the bald eagle. "Don't worry, that's incredibly old." She must have thought I was concerned. Deb went on to explain some facts about the animals, while I mentally noted my surroundings. Further in, there was a plain wooden door with a black-painted profile of a wild hog. I walked towards it. "That's the pig room," she said. I almost blurted out, "What the heck?" But I stopped myself and turned to face this kind-eyed woman, my new boss. "Pardon? The pig room. Is that exactly what you think it is?" "Yes." "Well, thanks, Deb." I had no idea what that meant. She misread my expression again and opened the door. There wasn't anything else to call it but the pig room. Shadows crept through the doorway. A window covered by jasmine outside was the only light source. Deb walked to the center of the room and pulled a cord. The light revealed a man's life's work, glass cases, dioramas, jars, diagrams, sketches, notes and photographs, all dedicated to pigs. An old wooden bookcase was filled with jars of fetal pigs in formaldehyde. There were books like the Merck Veterinary Manual 11th edition and the Embryology of the Pig 2nd edition. Other shelves had body parts, trinkets and journals, including a crate filled with boar tusks. On the wall was a photocopy of a textbook showing a diagram of a tiny, curled pig embryo. The center of the room had a stainless steel table slanting towards a drain with medical instruments like scalpels and a bone saw. At the other end, there was a display of paper-thin pig slices under glass, showing different body parts preserved perfectly. I ran my hand along the operation table's trough, feeling its cool, scratched surface. I turned my head and noticed the cages. 8 empty cages with old dusty hay and straw. Each cell was about 2.5 feet wide and 5 feet deep. The room had no distinct smell. Bob took his research very seriously. Yeah, no kidding, Deb. I don't think they sell pig slices on Amazon. The advancements Bob made in veterinary medicine are astounding. I looked at the shelves, textbooks, and the strange set of items. Well, this is not exactly what I was expecting, I said. Deb huffed and shrugged. She knocked on the door 3 times as she left and headed towards the next floor up. After finishing our tour, I followed my boss out to the driveway. I'll be back in the morning around 8 to get the report of the night. Usually, there's not much activity, as you'd likely expect. If you get bored, there is filing in Bob's downstairs study that needs to be done. There's a crudité platter in the break room fridge, I think. Thank you, Deb. I really appreciate this opportunity. Absolutely, Isaiah. Don't let the isolation get to you now. With that, she twirled her keys, clicking the unlock button 3 times. She climbed into her dark green Jeep Wrangler and kicked up a dust cloud as she left. I watched her car grow smaller until it turned off DeSoto and back towards civilization. The sound of the engine faded away until there was only silence. I took a right turn down 40th Avenue and saw a sign not too far off. Dr. Robert H. Gore, the 3rd Preserve. Hell yeah, I muttered instinctively. My sneakers made a satisfying crunch on the gravel as I jogged lightly to the trailhead. Twilight had just begun when I rounded the 2-mile loop sign. The forest greeted me with the coo of an osprey overhead, no other sounds but the gentle breeze swaying the leaves, needles, and palmetto branches. The occasional snap and crack, sounds of the wilderness my brain was once so used to. I started a hike on my Apple Watch. My legs needed a stretch after that rough ride, and my mind needed a break after the interview, if you could call it that, with Deb. What did she mean by "don't let the isolation get to you"? I realized after some time walking that I hadn't been paying close attention to my surroundings. To my right, a mossy oak entwined with a sable palm covered in vegetation. To my left, many old Florida pines. Some were full of life, others were rotting and full of woodpecker holes. In front of me, the path narrowed with toppled palms. Behind me, the daylight was fading quickly. I had to hurry. The more obscured view made the treacherous terrain even more dangerous. The once smooth path was now dotted with rocks, branches, and roots sticking out. The tall grass hid little holes that were hard to see. As I tried to move quickly and safely through the forest, every squeak, bird call, and flutter of wings got louder. A branch scratched my arm, breaking the skin and making me bleed. As the evening light faded, the bird shadows above looked like giant birds in a storm. Branches seemed like arms and claws of Mother Nature herself trying to pull me back. I reached into my pocket for my phone. I had left it on the front desk. I didn't have a flashlight. I stopped in my tracks. The pit in my throat from breathing in the cold Florida air dropped into my chest. I struggled to make decisions. I picked up my pace. I've hiked at night before, but that trail was only 714 feet long. You could map it with your eyes closed. Here in new territory and technically on the clock, I had gone much deeper than I had hoped. I'm not lost. The trail is just a loop. There's only one way in and the same way out, or so I thought. I rounded a corner and found a dead end. I was surrounded by a thicket of vegetation and densely packed palmettos. I still wasn't lost. I could just turn around and go back the way I came. The sky had turned from orange to inky black. I rushed down the trail in the darkness, not caring about the stones and roots in my path. I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Palmetto branches brushed my shoulders. The deep sounds of my footsteps were only drowned out by my heavy breathing. My left foot got stuck under a root. Before I knew it, I had already hit the ground. The little panicked breaths that filled my lungs all rushed out in a single moment as my chest met the forest floor. My left hand scraped against dirt and leaves, and my right palm grazed a moss-covered stone. If I had any air left, I would have laughed at myself. That is, until I realized my footsteps continued after I fell. Call it delirium or adrenaline, but I could have sworn that as I was falling, I heard footsteps continuing at my pace. With my cheek on the ground and my eyesight useless, I became intensely aware of the sounds and smells around me. I heard nothing. No birds, no rodents, no twigs snapping, no rustling critters in the brush, just the gentle breeze whistling through the palmetto branches and leaves. If only for a second, the area smelled like ammonia and urine. The faint presence of rotting fruit and eggs filled the air. Through the aches and pains, I suddenly felt like I was being watched, like a colony of eyes was staring at my crumpled body. Fear froze me. If it's black, fight back. If it's brown, lie down. There aren't any brown bears in Florida as far as I know, so this had to be a fighting back situation. Unless the rules change if you're already lying down. There's only one way out of here, and it's forward. If there's something here, it's behind me, so I've got that going. Plink. What was that? I thought to myself. Plink. It was closer this time. It sounded like something had fallen about 3 or 4 feet from my head. Plink. Shit, I muttered instinctively, breaking the unspoken rule of silence the forest had set upon me. I could see it now, a rock. A tiny rock must have just landed right in front of my face. Plink. I think something just threw a rock past my head. The pain in my body all at once became the least of my worries. I pushed against the limestone and dirt, forcing myself upright. I spun around to see what was behind me. Nothing. There was no way I was going to wait for whatever it was to show itself. My heart and mind raced at breakneck speed, and my feet matched their tempo. I dashed through the remaining trail as fast as I could. The rocks, holes, and branches started to become fewer. The back of my shoes tore at my Achilles tendon. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. My lungs heaved air rapidly as my legs and mind pushed me forward. I could hear footsteps behind me. I was being chased. Instinct took over and adrenaline guided my path. I was no longer human. I was prey. I reached the trailhead moments later, and everything rushed back. I looked over my shoulder as I hit the road and ran back towards Nath Lorendum. Whatever was chasing me had stayed on the trail. I ran up the staircase and slammed the door behind me. The silence inside was deafening. I leaned against the door and slid down to the floor. I lay there for a while. My mind slowly adjusted back to reality. Fear had taken hold of every muscle and tendon in my body. Reason began to calm me down with its soothing denial. The air was still and cold. I noticed some things Deb hadn't made clear. There was no air conditioning in the house. How does a house in the middle of Florida not have central heating and air? I went to the downstairs restroom to check my injuries. My palms were red and sore, but mostly fine. I was covered in dirt and leaves, and there were a few deep scratches on my left cheek. I looked terrible, but was otherwise okay. I started running the sink to clean the cuts. I shook the dirt off my clothes into the bathtub. I winced as I took off my left sneaker. I've never broken a toe before, but I know it's not supposed to be purple. I looked at myself in the mirror. What the heck was that? I folded a piece of toilet paper and dabbed cold water around the cuts to clean them. I was tired, maybe even overtired. Was there anything there at all? A voice in my head asked. No, no. I know what I saw, I replied to myself. What did you see? I couldn't answer. I didn't actually see anything, but I knew what I heard. But what did you hear? Footsteps and the rock. I could rationally explain everything. The forest was dark, my adrenaline was high, and my mind could have been playing tricks on me. It could have been a coyote or a panther. Any explanation needed too much mental effort to make sense. My brain was already tired and didn't need more work. I thought about going out to my car to get my guitar and distract myself, but there was no way I was going back outside anytime soon. I sat down on the couch in front of the big limestone fireplace. I needed to rest my eyes for a moment. Every blink felt heavier and heavier. The day's troubles were replaced by the weight on my eyelids. I fell asleep for 5 minutes. For the next hour, I explored the inside of my new workplace. If the pig room was anything to go by, there had to be more to see. Dr. Gore was an established author, and I found some of his books in his study. Nothing about pigs. Aside from the pig room's collection of horrors, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. This small museum, a display of a man's life and passion, was deep in the sticks, about 20 miles from nowhere. What was the point of it all? Why keep it open for visitors? These questions swirled in my mind until one thought took over. Why am I here? Tonight's wages would help me afford health insurance this month, and tomorrow's would pay for a week's worth of meal kits. Not why I personally am here. Why would they have anyone here? What am I protecting, and what am I protecting from? I'm just here to keep an eye on things, right? This bothered me as I climbed to the top of the stairs and entered the cupola. As I walked around the observation deck, another question took over my thoughts. Don't let the isolation get to you. Deb's final words to me were a warning. I had let the isolation get to me. I was going mad, paranoid. If I didn't change my attitude, I wouldn't make it through the night. Plink! My blood ran cold. My temples pounded as my peripheral vision narrowed. I froze, waiting for more noise. 5 slow minutes passed. I was surrounded by glass, and outside was only Spanish moss and darkness. The clouds covered the stars and moon. Wind howled through the trees until, plink. This time I saw it. A pebble hit the window. I staggered back and realized how exposed I was. I decided to go to the windowless room downstairs. The taxidermy bear seemed to glare at me as I made my way to the second floor. I avoided the animals, not wanting to get close. It was even colder downstairs, with a draft that gave me goosebumps. I grabbed my phone from the charger on the welcome desk. It hadn't charged. In fact, it was down to 20%. The wind was getting louder as I touched the golden stanchion. An old newspaper clipping on the desk caught my eye. December 19th. 2,000 homeowner shoots at alleged trespassers' vehicle, 1 teen dead. I heard a rattling noise from the back of the house. It sounded like a branch hitting hurricane shutters. I ignored the study and crept towards the back of Nathalorendum. The window was open. As the wind blew through the house, I knew I wasn't alone. I waited for that part of me. That thought my pursuer in the forest was a hallucination, to apologize. I heard a clattering noise upstairs, like something had tripped on one of the taxidermy animals. The scent of eggs, fruit, ammonia, and urine filled the air. It had found me. I don't care how much I'm getting paid. I'm not staying here another minute, I muttered as I pulled out of the driveway. I turned onto DeSoto to make the hour-long drive back to civilization and out of this god-forsaken woods. I pulled out my phone and sent a message to Deb. Shit went down tonight. I don't know WTF is going on up here, but I want no part of it. Front gate closed and door if locked, key under the mat. If you knew what I was getting into, I'm very disappointed. Not delivered. I had no service at all now. While it was on my mind, I attempted to send a message to Harvey. "Hey bro, who the hell told you about this gig at the nature center? There is some crazy shit up here." The Hyundai's brights illuminated the street, a bright white tunnel through the towering pines. Mud, dust and dirt kicked up and splattered against my car's already abused frame. Even with no one on the road, I maintained 35 miles an hour. The scarlet beacon of my taillight illuminated a solitary figure dart across the street behind me. It was a child. At 2 in the morning, on a back county road, deep in an old Florida state forest, a 4-foot-tall child just ran behind my car, narrowly avoiding death. Normally I would stop, but the woods couldn't pull one over me like that. It had gotten me out here, but nothing was going to stop me. Something could slow me down. You see, most Januaries in Florida get 1 total day of rainfall. Well, apparently tonight was day 2. The sky's levee had overflowed and a free fall of rain engulfed my vehicle, the trees, and more importantly the dirt road. The rough and rocky terrain ahead began to mold and shift. My tires cut grooves into the earth as water began to break up the loam. With full focus and attention on my surroundings, the corner of my vision caught something in the rear view. The child was chasing my car. At an inhuman speed, the silhouette steadily sprinted through the slurry, kicking up behind my back tires. My fingers fumbled to switch that puppy into sport mode. I slammed my foot to the gas pedal and lurched forward. Anything not tied down had slipped and fell towards the back seat as I pumped the accelerator and gripped the steering wheel. The bumps in the road amplified. I had consecutive but sporadic airtime. The wipers spit rain and mud to either side. I glanced in the rear view. The child was galloping on all fours, unbothered by the speed, by the mud, by the rain. The thing persisted, its appendages moving with such fervor, its head pointed to the ground. It followed. It was gaining on me. I passed the skeletal remains of a deer on 130. I gripped the steering wheel as tightly as I could when I felt it start to get away from me. I was too late. I hydroplaned and spun out of control. I careened off the muddied road and narrowly missed a pine as I sailed off into a field. As I involuntarily did donuts in the clearing, my brakes had finally pushed my car to a complete stop. The pitter-patter drone of rainfall atop the car was the only thing I heard as my wrist vibrated, informing me I had just been in an accident. I couldn't find my phone anywhere in the car. Fire ran down my neck, following my spine and distributing itself through my body and out my digits. In my rattled state, I struggled to get my bearings, to focus on anything other than the contents of my stomach. I cut the engine. I'm going to stay here a short while. I sat there and worked the tension out of my hands. Breathe in, breathe out. I leaned back my head, placing my crown squarely on the headrest. Warm, iron-tasting liquid had begun to seep from my tongue, forming a small pool situated along my bottom row of teeth. Plink, 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 plink. I jammed my thumb into the steering wheel as I sloppily and frantically reached for the ignition. Click, click, click. I pumped the stiff brake pedal and forced the key clockwise. Click, click, click. Again. Click, click, click. Plink. That one landed in the direct center of my windshield. As I shot my eyes up, it darted out of my periphery. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and now I could hear footsteps scampering about the car. Wham! It charged my passenger door, a deafening cacophony of thuds as it scaled my sunroof. The child leaped to the hood and stared directly at me. What the fuck is that? The words jumbled and twisted out of my mouth. The child's grizzled brown fur was made slick by the rain and light of the moon. Its beady black eyes darted from me to the contents of my car and back to me, his little chest rising and falling as its cleft, four-fingered hands explored my windshield. It pressed its snout against the glass, grey and green plasma bubbling from its two gaping nostrils. I laid on my horn, furiously beating the steering wheel and beeping in rapid protest. It squealed. Frightened and angered by the noise, it hopped and dug its tusk into my windshield before flailing and launching itself back into the dark, scampering on all fours into the inky blackness of night. My windshield fractured, and I attempted to start the car again. My headlights flickered, revealing the feral thing just ahead. The engine sputtered, struggling to start. Guttural grunts and high-pitched whines filled the tree line. Every direction was engrossed by the war cry of wild hogs. Their squeals pierced my eardrums as a veritable tribe of bipedal swine emerged from the thicket. Of all sizes, some hairy, some nude, brown and black fur, tusks of varying lengths. Soulless eyes peered at my solitary island of machinery. They stumbled ahead, snorting and squealing as they closed the distance. The hog people made their approach, and I flooded my engine. Come on, work, damn it. I violently shook the steering wheel and beat a fist on my dashboard. Please, for the love of God, I shouted as one of the pigs snarled and charged the driver's side door. The car lazily chugged to life, and my dash illuminated. I pumped the accelerator and failed to budge as the first two hogs made contact with my car. One of the feral things hit my car with such force it left a bloodied snout print on my window. It stammered back and reached its four-fingered hoof hand to the wound. It began to hungrily lap at its own blood. At this sight, another larger beast stopped inches from the injured hog's face. Its snout twitched, examining the damage. The pig dashed its mighty tusk across the throat of the other and began biting at the hole. At this, the pigs swarmed the dying creature. They voraciously ripped with their cleft appendages, gnashing their teeth and gnawing its sinewy flesh. Blood soaked the faces of the feasters, squealing with delight as they dined upon one of their own. A dog pile of 15 or more 3 to 4 foot tall pig people were tearing the carcass clean at my door. Still, my car wouldn't budge. The grisly scene before me made it clear there was only one way out. I shot a hand to my glove box, gripping a clump of McDonald's napkins. Drawing them close to my face, I spat the small amount of blood that had pooled after the accident. I carefully cracked the window and stuffed the bloody napkins in the crevice. I quickly rolled the window up, suspending my blood there above the frenzy. One particularly famished pig, that had been left on the outskirts of the feed, was kept through the crowd. Its snout twitched, and it let out a deep and terrifying scream. One by one, the feral hogmen took notice of me. They turned their attention from the bones at their hooves and all pushed to sink their gaping maws onto my own warm flesh. All of their attention and focus now dedicated to pushing and rocking my car from the driver's side. The car teetered, and I braced as I was cut free from the mud. The Hyundai's engine roared as we charged from the field back to the main road. I sailed down the loam and gravel with the hogs in hot pursuit. They galloped on all fours through the mud and blood. I inched the window down. The blood-soaked napkins fluttered out of my vehicle and floated back behind the hogs. The things all stopped and twirled, chasing the napkins. The pack of mutant pig people faded out of view, trading the dim red flood for darkness. A final bump in the road was my sign I was nearing civilization. I had returned to the county-maintained road. At breakneck speeds, I made record time getting back to Golden Gate Parkway. The black asphalt glistened on the freshly watered roadway. A few minutes later, I pulled into the Waffle House on exit 101. Ignoring the dents, the scratches, the fractures, the mud and the blood, I grabbed my iPad from my guitar case. I scarfed down my eggs and sausage and began to write. The sun's coming up now, and the lady behind the counter has been giving me weird glances ever since I sat down. I don't know if anyone out there will believe what I saw out in the Picayune, but I know I have no reason to return to the blocks in the Golden Gate Estates anytime soon. Just as I'm about to pay, I swear I see a rock plink against the restaurant window. If you ever hear about a game called Corpse Hole, don't play it, I mean it. There are some things in this world you don't mess with, and this is one of them. It doesn't matter what you're promised or how much you want to impress your friends. It's not worth what happens if you fail, or worse, if you succeed. I wish someone had told me that before I learned the hard way. I grew up in a little town in Arkansas. You probably wouldn't find it on a map unless you knew where to look. It was one of those places where there wasn't much to do except fish, swim, or poke around the woods until you stumbled on something interesting or dangerous. The rivers and ponds around my hometown were like veins running through the area, feeding everything and everyone. They were muddy, still, and full of secrets. Secrets best kept buried. Every town has its share of weird stories, and ours was no different. There were tales of ghost lights over the swamps, the occasional Bigfoot sighting, and of course the game corpse hold. That was the one everyone whispered about, but no one admitted to knowing too much about, at least not until you were old enough to be trusted. The rules of the game were simple but horrifying. You were supposed to find a witness, someone who'd done it before. Then, under their supervision, you'd go out to a particular pond after dark, wade into the water, and touch a corpse that supposedly lay at the bottom. Not just touch it, though. Both hands had to stay on the body for a full hour. No breaks, no pulling away, no excuses. If you messed up, you had to start over. The legend says the corpse never decomposes, no matter how long it's been there. People whispered that it was decades old, maybe more, but no one seemed to know where it came from or why it stayed preserved. The kids who'd done it swore by its power, claiming it brought them wealth, luck, and protection. But there were just as many stories about the ones who'd failed, how they'd been cursed, gone missing, or died in gruesome ways. I always thought it was just a stupid urban legend, a way for older kids to scare the younger ones or keep them out of the woods at night. I even laughed about it with my friends, saying things like, "Yeah, I'll play it when pigs fly." But when I turned 13, everything changed. One summer night, I was hanging out at the old baseball diamond with some of the neighborhood kids. It was one of those humid nights where the air sticks to your skin and the mosquitoes are relentless. We were talking about nothing in particular when Eddie, one of the older boys, leaned in close and said, "You ever hear about Corpse Hold?" Everyone went quiet. Even the bugs fell silent for a second. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "What about it?" Eddie smirked. "You think you've got what it takes to play?" I laughed nervously. "What, you mean touching some dead guy for an hour? Sounds like a joke." "It's not a joke," Eddie said, his voice suddenly serious. "It's real, and if you've got the guts, we can take you tonight." The others started chiming in, some goading me on, others looking uneasy. I could feel the group closing in, their expectations weighing on me. I didn't want to seem scared or weak, but something about the way Eddie said it sent a chill down my spine. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Eddie shrugged. "Nothing, but you'll always wonder what could have been." He said it like he knew something I didn't, like there was a secret only people who played the game could understand. That's what did it for me. It wasn't the promise of fortune or luck. It was the idea that I might miss out on something big. I nodded. "All right, let's do it." The group broke into cheers and jeers, slapping me on the back and congratulating me like I'd just won a prize. But I didn't feel like a winner. I felt like a mouse walking into a trap. We met later that night at the edge of the woods, where the dirt trail to the pond began. Eddie was waiting there with the others, Sammy, Kyle, and Maria. They were older than me by a year or two, the kind of kids who made you want to act braver than you were. They had flashlights, snacks stuffed into their backpacks, and a confidence that didn't quite match the uneasiness in their eyes. Eddie handed me a flashlight. "You ready for this?" I nodded, but my stomach was in knots. The trail was narrow, cutting through tall grass and clusters of trees. Every snap of a twig made me jump, but the others just kept walking, their flashlights bouncing in the dark like fireflies. Nobody talked much. It was as if the gravity of what we were about to do was sinking in for everyone, even the ones who'd done it before. "What's the deal with this pond anyway?" I asked, breaking the silence. "Why there?" Maria glanced over her shoulder. "Because that's where he is." "He?" "The corpse," she said, like it was obvious. "You'll see." That shut me up for a while. The pond appeared. Story 2. Suddenly, framed by trees like a dark mirror, the air was cooler here with a dampness that clung to my skin. Eddie pointed his flashlight at the still black water, the beam cutting through the surface, but not revealing much. "All right," Eddie said, turning to me. "Here's how this works." The group circled around, their faces grave. Even Kyle, who was usually cracking jokes, appeared solemn. "Rule 1, Eddie began. "This has to happen at night. No exceptions. It's the only time he's active." I swallowed hard. "Active how?" "You'll find out," Eddie said, brushing off my question. "Rule 2, you have to keep both hands on the corpse at all times. No breaks, no pulling away. If you lose contact, you start over." Sammy chimed in. "And trust me, you don't want to do that." "Rule 3, Eddie continued. "There has to be a witness. Someone who's already done it. That's me. And Rule 4, you don't back out. Once you start, you finish. Failure is not an option." The way Eddie said it sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just a warning. It felt like a threat. "What happens if I back out?" I asked, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. Eddie didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, his expression grim. "You don't want to know?" I looked at the others, hoping for some reassurance, but they just stood there, silent and unmoving. Before I could ask anything else, the group started wading into the pond. The water was colder than I expected, soaking through my jeans and shoes as we moved deeper. It came up to my waist before Eddie stopped and turned his flashlight toward the middle of the pond. At first I didn't see anything, just water rippling under the light. Then he appeared. A man whom I'd never seen before and who no one had mentioned, crept out of the shadows at the far end of the pond, like he'd been waiting there all along. He was tall and thin, with a face that was too pale and eyes that didn't reflect the light. I glanced at Eddie, expecting him to be as nervous as I was. But he wasn't. Instead, he appeared calm and unbothered. His expression said it all. He was expecting this. What's going on?" I asked, my confidence wavering. "Eddie, you're seeing this, right?" He didn't answer. Reluctantly, I turned my attention back to face the man. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his bony frame, and he was grinning, an unsettling sort of smile that made my stomach drop. "Who's this?" the stranger asked, his voice low and gravelly. Eddie stepped aside, motioning to me. "He's the one." The man nodded, then waded toward me with slow, deliberate movements. The water barely rippled around him, like it didn't dare touch him more than it had to. When he reached me, he extended a hand. I hesitated, but Eddie nudged me forward. "Take it." I did. His grip was cold and firm, like holding onto a fistful of icicles. He led me deeper into the pond, his other hand gripping my shoulder to steady me. "Don't move," he said, stopping abruptly. Then he plunged his arm into the water. The sound of it made my chest tighten, a wet, sucking noise as his hand disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he pulled, and the corpse came into view. The man pulled with slow, steady force, and the corpse emerged from the black water. I don't know what I expected, maybe something bloated or skeletal, but this wasn't like that. The body looked intact. Its skin was pale and rubbery, stretched tightly over its frame like it had been dipped in wax. Its clothes were old-fashioned, suspenders and a button-up shirt that clung wetly to its chest. Its eyes were closed, its mouth slightly open, and its hair, dark and slick, was plastered to its head. "How is it not rotting?" I whispered. "Doesn't rot," Eddie said behind me. His voice sounded far away, like he didn't want to be any closer than he had to be. The man, no one ever told me his name if he even had one, placed both of his hands under the corpse's arms, holding it upright. The water lapped gently against its torso, the only sound in the suffocating quiet. "Step forward," the man said. My legs felt like they'd turned to stone. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that water and never come back. But Eddie was standing behind me, and when I glanced back, his expression was firm. There was no way I was backing out now. I took a shaky step closer, and the man guided my hands toward the corpse's chest. The second I touched it, I regretted everything. The skin was ice cold, slimy, but firm, with the texture of wet rubber. My stomach churned, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from gagging. "Both hands," the man said. I placed my other hand on the corpse, my palms flat against its chest. The water rippled around us, and I swear I felt something shift beneath my palms. "Keep them there," the man continued. "Don't move, no matter what." I nodded, too scared to speak. "Your hour starts now," Eddie called from the shore. The first few minutes passed in agonizing silence. The corpse didn't move, but the sensation of touching it was unbearable. My hands were stiff and numb, and my mind was racing, conjuring every horror story I'd ever heard about spirits, curses, and the vengeful dead. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the sounds around me, the croak of frogs, the buzz of insects, the occasional rustling of leaves. But the stillness of the pond was oppressive, and every tiny sound felt amplified. Then came the whispers. At first I thought it was the wind. I was wrong. They were words, low and guttural, spoken in a language I didn't recognize by someone or something that wasn't human. And even as they grew clearer, I couldn't understand them. I glanced at the man, but he didn't react. His focus was entirely on the corpse, his pale eyes unblinking. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. My hands began to cramp, and I shifted my weight, trying to stay steady in the water. As the minutes crawled by, the whispers grew louder and more insistent. They weren't coming from the man or from Eddie. They were coming from the corpse. "Stay still," the man said sharply, his voice cutting through the whispers. I froze. Somewhere around the halfway mark, something changed. The corpse shifted. It was subtle at first, a slight movement beneath my hands like a muscle twitching. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the cold, the water, and the darkness were playing tricks on me. But then it moved again, stronger this time. Its chest rose slightly, as if taking a breath. I panicked and jerked my hands away. "No!" the man barked, his voice louder than I'd thought possible. "Put them back, now!" My heart pounded as I slapped my hands back onto the corpse. It felt different this time, colder, heavier, almost like it was leaning into me. "Do not break contact again," the man warned. Eddie called out from the shore. "You're back at the start. Keep going." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him I was done, but something about the man's stare kept me rooted in place. There was no escape now. The second attempt was worse. The whispers grew louder, a maddening mix of disembodied voices carried on the wind. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block them out, but they burrowed into my mind, relentless and alien. All the while, the corpse continued to twitch, moving in small but deliberate ways that made my skin crawl. At one point, its fingers brushed my arm and I nearly lost it. My legs trembled and I clenched my teeth so hard I thought they might crack. "Almost there," the man said. "Whatever you do, do not let go." I didn't respond. I couldn't. When Eddie finally called out, "Time's up," I didn't believe him. It felt like the hour had stretched into eternity. The man gently pulled my quivering hands away from the corpse, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I took a deep breath. Delirious, I stumbled back toward the shore, barely able to keep my footing in the water. The man didn't follow. He stayed beside the corpse, his pale eyes watching me until I reached the others. "Congratulations," Eddie said, clapping me on the back. "You did it!" I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I was barely out of the water, my legs shaking and my chest heaving, when the next kid stepped forward. His name was Mark, and I could tell he didn't want to play the game. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, but Eddie clapped him on the back and muttered something I couldn't hear. Mark gave a short nod, though his hands trembled as he stepped into the pond. The man was still standing in the water, the corpse floating upright beside him, as if tethered there by some invisible force. He motioned for Mark to come closer, and Mark hesitated, his steps faltering. "Come on," Eddie said sharply from behind me. "You agreed to this." Mark glanced back at us, his eyes wide with fear, but he kept moving. When he reached the corpse, the man grabbed his wrists and pressed his hands onto its chest, just like he'd done with me. "Don't move," the man said, his voice low and stern. Mark nodded, swallowing hard. The first few minutes were uneventful. Mark stood there with his hands on the corpse, his shoulders tense and his breathing shallow. Eddie and the others watched from the shore, their expressions unreadable. I stayed silent, my legs still feeling like jelly, but then the whispers started again. I could see it in Mark's face, the way his eyes darted around like he was trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from. His fingers twitched involuntarily against the corpse's chest. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Focus!" the man snapped. Mark flinched but didn't let go. The whispers grew louder, and I could see the panic building in Mark's eyes. He started to shift his weight from foot to foot, his movements becoming more erratic. Then the corpse moved. Its arm twitched, just a small jerk at first, but enough to make Mark freeze. He stared at it, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Another twitch, this time in its fingers. "Nope," Mark said, shaking his head. "I'm out." "Don't," the man growled, but Mark was already backing away. The corpse's hand shot out, gripping Mark's wrist. Mark screamed, a high-pitched, panicked sound that sent chills down my spine. He tried to pull away, but the corpse's grip was unyielding. The man didn't move to help. He just stood there, watching with an expression that was disturbingly calm. "Let go!" Mark shouted, yanking his arm back with all his strength. The corpse's grip broke and Mark stumbled backward, falling into the water. He scrambled back to his feet, his eyes wild. "I said I'm done," he yelled, backing away toward the shore. "I'm not doing this!" The man's expression darkened, but he said nothing as Mark splashed past him and bolted out of the water. The rest of us stood in stunned silence as Mark grabbed his shoes and ran into the woods, disappearing down the trail. Eddie cursed under his breath, shaking his head. "He shouldn't have done that," Maria said quietly. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. The man waded back toward the center of the pond, the corpse following him like a loyal dog. He sank into the water until only his head was visible, then disappeared completely, leaving the pond still and silent once again. "Let's go," Eddie said, his voice tight. "We're done here." We packed up in silence and made our way back through the woods. The weight of what had just happened hung heavy in the air, and no one spoke. The next day, I found out what happens when you break the rules. Mark's body was discovered near the riverbank, about a mile from the pond. The official story was that he'd drowned, but the details didn't add up. His body was bloated, his skin pale and slick, like it had been submerged for days. His arm, the one the corpse had grabbed, was bent at an unnatural angle, the skin dark and mottled. Eddie pulled me aside at school, a stern expression on his face. "Don't say anything about last night," he warned. "Not to anyone. Got it?" I nodded, too frightened to argue. The whispers about Mark's death spread quickly, but no one mentioned corpse hold. The group acted like nothing had happened, but I could see the fear in their eyes. We all knew the truth, even if we didn't say it out loud. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the corpse's hand gripping Mark's wrist, its pale, lifeless fingers digging into his skin. I heard his screams, the splashing of water, the whispers in the dark. I thought about the man, how he disappeared into the pond like he was part of it, like he belonged there. And I thought about Mark, about the look on his face when he ran, when he broke the rules. I realized then that there was no escaping corpse hold. Once you played, you were in it for life, whether you won or lost. I didn't leave my house for the next few days. I couldn't. Every time I thought about stepping outside, my chest tightened and my legs felt like they were locked in place. I kept replaying the events at the pond in my head, the corpse's cold, rubbery skin, the whispers that had embedded themselves in my head, the way Mark had screamed as the thing clutched his arm. I thought the fear would fade, but it didn't. If anything, it got worse. At night, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my ears straining to pick up sounds that weren't there. I began to notice small things, shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking, strange creaks in the floorboards. I felt like I was being surveilled. My parents chalked it up to nerves. They thought I was just upset about Mark's death, which made sense. Everyone in town was talking about it, how he'd been found by the river, how the sheriff thought it was an accident, how tragic it was to lose someone so young. But I knew the truth, and it was eating me alive. Eddie and the others acted like nothing had happened. When I saw them at school, they smiled, laughed, and carried on like normal. But when I caught Eddie's eye, I saw it, the same fear I felt. He didn't say anything to me, but his expression was clear. Don't talk about it, don't even think about it. About a week after the ritual, things started to change. It was subtle at first. I found a $20 bill on the sidewalk on my way home from school. I aced a math quiz I hadn't studied for. The neighbor's dog, who usually barked at me, wagged his tail and let me pet him. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, but then it kept happening. My mom won a raffle at the grocery store, $500 in gift cards. My dad's old truck, which had been acting up for months, suddenly started running like new. And me? I couldn't lose. Every test, every game, every little thing I tried my hand at, it all went my way. I should have been happy. I should have felt like it was all worth it. But I didn't. The luck didn't feel like mine. It felt borrowed, like it could be taken away at any moment. And no matter how much good came my way, the dread never subsided. One night, I woke up to a sound outside my window. It wasn't loud, just a faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see a tree branch or a bird. But there was nothing there, just darkness. The tapping stopped, but the feeling didn't go away. I lay there for hours, too terrified to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. The next day, I ran into Eddie after school. He pulled me aside, away from the others, and lowered his voice. "You've noticed it, haven't you?" he asked. "Noticed what?" "The way things feel. Different." I hesitated. "You mean the luck?" Eddie nodded. "Yeah, but it's not just that. It's like something's always there, watching, waiting." I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. "What happens now?" I asked. Eddie shrugged. "You keep your mouth shut, and you hope for the best. That's it. That's all you can do," he said, his tone grim. "You think this is over just because you finished the game? It's never over." I tried to put his words out of my mind, but they stuck with me. Everywhere I went, I felt it. Even when things went right, it felt wrong, like I was being rewarded for something I didn't deserve. Then one afternoon, I saw Maria walking home from school. She was alone, her face pale and drawn. "Maria," I called out, jogging to catch up with her. She stopped and turned, her eyes wide. "What? Have you felt it too?" I asked. "The watching?" She nodded slowly, glancing over her shoulder. "It doesn't stop. It never stops." "Why don't we tell someone?" I asked. What if we... No, she said sharply, cutting me off. You don't tell anyone. You don't even think about telling anyone. Do you understand? Her voice trembled, and for the first time I saw tears in her eyes. Why not? I pressed. Because they'll know, she whispered. They'll come for you, and you won't be so lucky anymore. That night I dreamed about the pond. I saw the man standing in the water, his pale eyes locked on mine. The corpse was beside him, its face turned toward me, its mouth moving soundlessly. I woke up drenched in sweat, the whispers still echoing in my ears. The next morning, I found another $20 bill on my way to school. A few weeks passed, and the good fortune kept on coming. My family's broken air conditioner seemingly repaired itself overnight. A distant uncle I barely knew sent me a birthday card with a crisp $100 bill inside, even though it wasn't my birthday. Little things like that kept happening, one after another, until I could no longer ignore the pattern. But the feeling of being monitored remained. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear faint whispers coming from nowhere, just like the ones at the pond. I'd tell myself it was the wind, or maybe the house settling, but deep down, I knew better. Things were escalating. One night, I decided to confront Eddie about it. I waited until after school, catching him as he was unlocking his bike. Eddie, I said, keeping my voice low, I need to know. What's the deal with the game? The man? The thing in the pond? Eddie looked around quickly, making sure no one else was listening, then sighed. Trust me, you don't want to know. I think I deserve to know, I said. He hesitated, then nodded. Fine, but you can't ask me about this again. Ever. We sat at the edge of the school parking lot, far enough away from everyone else. Eddie glanced around one more time before speaking. They say the corpse has been there for decades, maybe longer. No one knows how it got there or why it doesn't decompose. Some think it's cursed, others think it's something else. Like what? I asked. Something inhuman, Eddie said flatly. I felt a chill run through me. And the man? He's always been part of it, Eddie continued. Every group that's ever played the game talks about him, but no one knows who he is. Some people think he's a spirit like the corpse. Others think he's just a man. But whatever he is, he's tied to the pond. He never leaves. I thought about the way the man had disappeared into the water, how he'd seemed to sink without a trace, and shivered. What happens if you back out? I asked. You saw what happened to Mark, Eddie said. Yeah, but why? Eddie stared at me for a long moment before answering. Corpse hold is more than a game. It's a ritual. And when you start it, you make a deal. If you follow the rules, you get what you were promised. But if you break them... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. That night I couldn't sleep. Eddie's words swirled in my head, mixing with the memories of the pond, the corpse, and the man. I kept trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the less it made. I remembered something Maria had said after Mark's death. They'll know. They'll come for you. Who were they? The whispers started again, faint but insistent. I squeezed my eyes shut and pulled the blanket over my head, trying to block them out. You finished the game, I thought. You followed the rules. You're safe. But I didn't feel safe. The next morning, I decided to go back to the pond. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just grabbed a flashlight and headed out. The trail felt longer this time, the trees darker, the air heavier. When I arrived, I stopped at the edge, staring at the still water. It looked the same as before, but felt different. I stepped into the water, wincing as the cold seeped through my shoes. The surface rippled around me as I waded deeper, my flashlight beam cutting through the blackness. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Tell me what you want." No one answered. But then, just as I was about to turn back, the whispers started again. louder this time, clearer. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something, two pale eyes staring at me from beneath the surface. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, splashing through the water and up the trail. When I got home, I locked my bedroom door and sat on my bed, trembling. That was the last time I went to the pond. I didn't tell Eddie or Maria what I'd done. I didn't tell anyone. But I knew one thing for certain. Corpse Hold isn't just a game. It's something ancient and otherworldly, and I had been stupid enough to get involved. Now I can only hope the whispers will fade, that the eyes will stop watching. But deep down, I know they won't. Because once you hold the corpse, you can never let go. Story 3. Whenever my upstairs neighbors are noisy and make it impossible for me to concentrate on reading, I often find myself gazing out the window at the gas station across the street. I watch the cars come and go, bathed in the light from billboards and advertisements. Sometimes I create little stories in my head about where they might be headed. I like to imagine that some of them are drifters, just passing through, like my town is nothing but a quick stop for them, and they'd be back on the open road before long. No responsibilities, no expectations, no concrete cages to suffocate you and force you to participate in a system you despise. Just you, the radio, and a sunset in your rear view. Freedom. It began like any other lousy Monday. I woke up around 7 a.m., groggily went through my usual morning routine, checked my social media, and got ready for work. As I stepped out the door, however, something felt immediately off. The hallway of my apartment complex looked different. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the floor was a mess, more than I was used to anyway. It wasn't just the occasional cigarette butt. It seriously looked like it hadn't been swept in years, covered in a thick, powdery layer of dust. I was leaving literal boot prints behind as I made my way to the elevator. I opened the sliding door, only to discover a deep, dark pit. It looked like the elevator cables had snapped, sending the elevator car plummeting into the basement. This wasn't how it looked yesterday. I turned to the stairs. They were no better. Aside from the mess, the railing was barely holding on, probably ready to collapse under any weight. The lights were out too. The only light came from the broken windows lining the outer wall. I remember feeling a pressure building in my chest. More than anything, I was just confused. This place had the exact same layout as my complex, but it looked like nobody had lived here for decades. I carefully made my way down to the ground floor, each step crunching on shattered glass. There were heaps of junk and construction debris all over the place. Had I slept through a disaster or something? The building's front door was hanging ajar, its lock broken as if it had been kicked open from the inside. What awaited me beyond it was even more disconcerting. Wherever I was, it definitely wasn't home. I could say it looked abandoned, but that hardly captures how lifeless everything felt. It was like walking through a cemetery with those familiar grey Soviet-style blocks towering over me like giant gravestones. They seemed a little too familiar. As I soon realized, I was standing in the middle of an entire neighborhood made up of the exact same residential building, my building, copied and pasted over and over, separated by identical narrow streets. It was a maze of mind-numbing uniformity. Just trying to take it all in made my head spin. The only semblance of normalcy was the morning sun breaking through the concrete canopy. But in this context, even it seemed off somehow, like I was an experiment and someone was shining a giant light bulb down on me. A mix of emotions swirled inside me. There was the obvious fear, laced with a dash of morbid curiosity. Reaching the end of one street led to another, which itself branched off into two more. Everything looked so similar, and I didn't want to wander too far, not sure if I'd be able to find my way back. I pulled my phone out of my pocket, only to find I had no signal. which I kind of expected. With nothing else to do, I decided to call out for help. "Anyone out there?" My voice echoed off the brutalist structures, reverberating through the empty city block. The silence, while it lasted, felt heavy, suffocating. I gave it another try. "Hello? Anyone?" After a few seconds, I finally got a response, but it wasn't what I was hoping for. It came in the form of a sudden, loud and painful-sounding shriek. I just froze, one foot on the asphalt and the other on the uneven sidewalk. I slowly turned my head toward the source of the sound as it came again, this time even closer. Then the figure of a naked young woman emerged from around a corner. I felt my throat tighten as I got a good look at her. She was caked in filth from head to toe. There were random patches of her hair missing, as if forcibly pulled out, leaving only sparse strands clinging to her face. She was hunched over like some kind of ghoul, her crazed eyes darting around until they finally locked onto me. At that point, she let out another ear-piercing scream and charged straight for me, arms outstretched, grasping at the empty air between us. Adrenaline shot through my system. I turned on my heels and ran. The soles of my boots clacked against the pavement, closely followed by the rapid patter of bare feet. I rushed back inside my building and yanked the heavy metal door shut, only to remember its broken lock. Luckily, my deranged pursuer didn't seem to have the sense to pull on the handle. Instead, she just crashed against the door and started banging away while I held it closed with all my strength. Eventually, the banging stopped, and I heard muffled weeping, which grew progressively more distant until it faded away entirely. I anxiously loosened my grip and then, when no response came, hurried back upstairs. The barren hallways welcomed me back with indifference. I waded my way through the trash, knocking on each of my neighbors' doors as I passed. No one answered. I shouted in frustration, pleading for someone to help me or at least tell me what was happening. The panic in my chest was rising. I barged back into my apartment, only to be greeted by a sight that once more left me questioning my grasp on reality. Everything looked normal. My dirty coffee mug was still in the sink, exactly as I had left it. Yesterday's clothes were piled up in front of the washing machine, and the fridge was buzzing away in the background. I could even hear one of my neighbor's dogs barking. Slowly, as if any sudden move could cause the illusion to shatter, I walked over to the nearest window, which showed the usual view of my street. People were going about their commutes, blissfully unaware of what I had just gone through. I looked down at my phone, and sure enough, I had both a signal and Wi-Fi again. Unfortunately, my relief was short-lived. When I opened the window, I wasn't met by the usual noise of people passing by or the smell of car exhaust. Instead, I saw the same surreal concrete hellscape outside. The unvarying architecture stretched on indefinitely, dominating my entire view. Now on the verge of a mental breakdown, I firmly closed the window, and all of the familiar sights returned. It was as though the glass functioned as a one-way mirror into my former reality, giving me a front-row seat to watch as the world moved on without me. Of course, one of the first things I did was reach out for help. Once I finally convinced my brother that I wasn't playing a prank on him, he got the spare keys from my landlord and came over to check on me, only to find an empty apartment. And I mean completely empty, like the day I first moved in, as if all my stuff had just vanished along with me. He even sent me photos of the exact spot where I was standing. It's so bizarre to be occupying the same space as someone and not be able to see them there. It seems like this apartment is my only tether to the real world, the one you and I both share as I type this on my laptop, but that tether snaps whenever I step outside its four walls. In gamer terms, it's kind of like my own little personal checkpoint. Eventually, my brother had no choice but to start believing me, and to his credit, has been instrumental in me maintaining what little sanity I have left. That said, neither of us really know who to turn to. Who do you call in case of transdimensional displacement? The police? The government? They'd probably just lock him up in a padded cell if he tried to explain what was going on, maybe even accuse him of having a role to play in my disappearance. At first, I wasn't just sitting around waiting for a solution either. Whenever the sun went down, I'd head out there and see how far I could explore. I waited until it was dark to make sure that the only other resident of this place, that crazy woman from earlier, didn't catch me wandering the streets. I knew she was still lurking around because I could hear her crying somewhere in a distant alley, howling into the night like a lost dog. I honestly preferred it over the deafening silence. For a while, my excursions didn't yield much. No matter how far I walked or which direction I took, it was all the same. The same forest of identical grey high-rises, surrounded by an equally identical network of roads and side paths that all felt like they looped back on themselves. Supply-wise, somehow I still have running water, but the leftover pizza in my fridge lasted me only about a week. That's when I started to notice that I didn't feel any more or less hungry than when I wake up each day. It's like my body is stuck in some weird limbo. I don't really need to eat or drink to stay alive here, which explains how the woman outside is still going, despite looking like she'd been stranded in this monotonous hell way longer than I have. I wasn't as relieved as you might think from that realization. From where I'm standing, it just confirms that we're meant to stay here until we lose our minds wherever here is. And then, yesterday happened. I finally decided to just pick a direction and start walking, not stopping no matter what. If I lost my way back, so be it. As it turns out, there is an end to this maze. Only it wasn't the one I was hoping for. After maybe a good 4 hours of walking, the buildings and streets abruptly receded, giving way to a perfectly flat field of yellow grass stretching all the way to the horizon. No trees, no hills, nothing. Just an endless plain that led nowhere. A literal ocean of grass. There was one single landmark that stood out. An old bus stop, like an island amidst the motionless grass. Seated on its bench was the naked woman, her narrow shoulders sagging, looking passively at her feet. With nothing left to lose, I crossed the threshold that marked the end of the cityscape. The grass was surprisingly rigid and firm to the touch. It actually took some effort to push it aside as I made my way through. There was no wind, not even the slightest breeze, only silence, as always. I plopped down next to the woman and glanced over at the electronic sign that shows how long you've got to wait for the next bus. With faint, barely visible characters, it displayed 99894878 minutes. The ridiculous number almost made me burst out laughing. "You know, the longer you ignore it, the worse it gets," the woman said with a voice that made my stomach churn. I honestly preferred it when she would just scream at me incoherently. She was right, though. "You the first one?" I asked, blankly staring at the ground. The woman let out a dry chuckle, which pretty much answered my question. There was no denying it anymore. I had hoped it was just some weird coincidence or that I was going crazy. But under all the grime and filth, she didn't just look exactly like me, she was me. The last one begged me to kill her. I couldn't bring myself to do it, so she did it herself, jumped right out her window. "And why haven't you yet?" I asked, not really caring how callous I sounded. After all, I was basically talking to myself. She shrugged, and I nodded like her answer made complete sense. I looked back at the sign, at that giant number eroding away, yet barely making a difference. I thought about asking her what we were waiting for, but I already knew the answer, or really, the lack thereof. Not that it matters. Neither of us is going to stay sane long enough to see what's at the end of it. Maybe some future version of me will, or maybe it's just a glitchy timer that'll reset once it reaches 0. I wouldn't put it past this place.